Imagine you are near the end of your life. Behind you lie 50 years of rule over the most powerful kingdom in the Western world. You have never lost a war of consequence. Your name is respected from Baghdad to Byzantium, the greatest city in Europe, a city of marble palaces and running water and libraries filled with manuscripts from every corner of the known world. That city bears the stamp of your will. Ambassadors have come from Germany and Constantinople just to stand in your presence. And now, lying near death, you pick up a pen and you count. You count the days in your entire life that you can honestly describe as days of pure happiness. The number is 14. This is the reflection left by Abd al-Rahman III, first Caliph of Cordoba, greatest ruler of Islamic Spain, and arguably the most powerful man in the Western world for the better part of the 10th century. A man who built an empire, silenced his enemies, and transformed a fractured and rebellious state into a civilizational peak, and who left behind one of the most devastating meditations on human happiness that any ruler in history has ever written. Welcome to Muslim Biographies. I am glad you are here. This channel tells the stories of the men and women who shaped Islamic history, not as simplified heroes or caricatures, but as full, complicated human beings whose lives deserve to be understood in their real depth and complexity. Today we are in al-Andalus. We are in the court of Cordoba, and we are with a man whose story begins with blood, passes through glory, and ends with a question that none of us can avoid. Before we go any further, if you are finding this story compelling, please take 5 seconds and hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to a small channel like this one. Every subscriber helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Abd al-Rahman was born in Cordoba on the 18th of December in the year 890. His father was Muhammad, a prince of the Umayyad dynasty that had ruled al-Andalus Muslim Spain for well over a century. The Umayyads had originally been the ruling dynasty of the entire Islamic world, stretching from Spain to Central Asia. That empire had been overthrown in 750 when the Abbasid family seized power and established their caliphate in Baghdad. One Umayyad prince escaped that massacre, Abd al-Rahman I, known as al-Dakhil, the immigrant, and he made his way to Spain, where he established an independent emirate in Cordoba. That is the dynasty into which our subject was born. But here is where it gets interesting, because Abd al-Rahman III was not simply an Arab prince. His grandmother on his mother's side was a Christian Basque woman from the royal house of Navarre. Chroniclers noted his striking appearance, reddish hair, blue eyes, born into an Arabic-speaking Muslim royal court, ruling a land where Arab, Berber, Visigothic, and Roman bloodlines had been intertwining for 2 centuries. This detail captures something true about what al-Andalus actually was. It was not a simple story. It was a place where boundaries blurred. His father was murdered before Abd al-Rahman could even know him, assassinated by his own uncle when the boy was just days old. Abd al-Rahman was raised in the palace of his grandfather, Emir Abdullah, who showed a clear preference for this particular grandson, despite having other candidates for succession. When Abdullah died in October 912, it was his 21-year-old grandson who inherited the throne. Now here is something important to understand about what he inherited. Al-Andalus in 912 was a kingdom in serious trouble. A man named Umar ibn Hafsun had been leading a major rebellion in the south for decades, operating from a fortress called Bobastro in the mountains near Malaga. Ibn Hafsun was a Muwallad, a person of local Iberian descent who had converted to Islam, and his revolt drew support from those who resented Arab dominance. At various points he even returned to Christianity himself. Beyond him, numerous warlords had carved out effectively autonomous territories across the peninsula. The emir's authority existed in theory far more than in practice. The young Abd al-Rahman did not hesitate. He understood that the problem was not simply one of military rebellion, but of political legitimacy. He launched annual campaigns against the rebels, offering generous terms to those who submitted and crushing those who refused. Ibn Hafsun died in 917, still undefeated, but the rebellion collapsed after his death. Toledo, long a thorn in Umayyad authority, was finally brought to heel in 933. At the same time, he pushed back against the Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile, and Navarre, that were expanding and probing from the north. By the later years of his reign, Christian kings were paying him tribute. That is how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted. And then came 929. In January of that year, Abd al-Rahman made the most dramatic political statement of his reign. He declared himself Caliph, not merely Emir, Caliph, the title belonging to the successor of the Prophet, the leader of all Muslims. At that time, two other powers made the same claim, the Abbasids in Baghdad and the rising Fatimids, a Shia dynasty in North Africa that claimed descent from the Prophet through his daughter Fatima, and posed an ideological challenge to Sunni political order across the Muslim world. It is a fair suggestion that the Fatimid threat drove Abd al-Rahman's hand. The Fatimids were competing aggressively for influence in North Africa, a region that mattered enormously to Cordoba, both strategically and commercially. By claiming the caliphal title, Abd al-Rahman was asserting that the legitimate Sunni caliphate was here, in al-Andalus. He took the throne name al-Nasir Lidin Allah, the defender of the faith. It was bold, it was also a masterstroke. It transformed the prestige of his court overnight. Cordoba began to operate on a genuinely imperial scale. Ambassadors arrived from Byzantium, from the Saxon kings of Germany, from the Christian kingdoms of Spain who had once fought him. The historian Hroswitha of Gandersheim, a German Benedictine nun writing in the late 10th century, described Cordoba as the ornament of the world. That phrase has stayed with historians ever since, and it tells you something about how the city was perceived even by outsiders with no reason to flatter its ruler. The golden age of Cordoba has often been described through the lens of convivencia, the idea that Muslims, Christians and Jews lived in harmonious coexistence. This narrative has been embraced across the political spectrum, sometimes for legitimate reasons, and sometimes for purposes that have more to do with modern arguments than medieval realities. It is imperative that we are precise about this. There was genuine tolerance in Abd al-Rahman's court by the standards of the 10th century. The Jewish scholar Hasdai ibn Shaprut served as Abd al-Rahman's personal physician, his confidant, and effectively his Minister of Foreign Affairs. Hasdai conducted diplomatic correspondence with Jewish communities from the Khazar kingdom to Egypt, patronized Hebrew poetry and scholarship, and embodied the intellectual flourishing that was genuinely possible for Jews in Cordoba. Christians held positions in the administration. This was real, but this was also still a medieval society with clear hierarchies. Non-Muslims paid the jizya tax and could not hold certain offices. Ethnic tensions between Arabs and Berbers were real and would contribute to the caliphate's collapse after Abd al-Rahman's death. Convivencia was a reality, but a qualified one. It was a sophisticated, relatively tolerant medieval Islamic monarchy, and that is remarkable enough without overstating it. In 936, Abd al-Rahman began construction of Madinat al-Zahra, a vast palace city 7 kilometers outside Cordoba, named after one of his favorite wives. Tens of thousands of workers, hundreds of columns brought from North Africa and Constantinople, fountains, gardens, a great hall with a basin of mercury that shimmered light around the room when the Caliph set it in motion. The entire apparatus of government was moved there. It was a statement in marble and stone about what the Caliphate of Cordoba had become, and it was also, it is fair to say, a performance of power as much as a functional capital. Abd al-Rahman was signaling to the Fatimids, the Abbasids, and the Christian kings that the Caliph of Cordoba commanded resources that no rival could match. And then there is the harder side, the side the Golden Age narrative tends to downplay. In 949, Abd al-Rahman ordered the execution of his own son, Abd Allah, who had been discovered conspiring against him. Think carefully about what it requires of a man to do that, to be so committed to the survival of his state, or so fearful of internal threat, that he executes his own child. The sources confirm this happened. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one, and it tells you something important about the kind of ruler Abd al-Rahman was beneath the patronage and the philosophy. He died on the 15th of October, 961, 70 years old, nearly half a century of rule. He left behind a unified, prosperous, and culturally extraordinary state at the peak of its power. His son al-Hakam II succeeded him and continued the patronage of learning with even greater intensity. The caliphate would begin to fracture within a generation of his death, eventually dissolving into competing Taifa kingdoms in 1031. But none of that diminishes what he built. He took a divided and rebellious emirate and made it the most powerful and cultured state in the Western world. And yet we come back to that piece of parchment. He had reigned for 50 years, beloved by his subjects and dreaded by his enemies. Riches and honours, power and pleasure had all waited upon his call, and he had counted the days of pure and genuine happiness in his life. 14. Out of 50 years. 14. Edward Gibbon quoted this passage and pushed back on it gently. He said the expectations of men are commonly immoderate, and their estimates seldom impartial. That is a fair point. We should not romanticize the melancholy of an old king as though it were universal truth. But I think there is something here that goes beyond the personal. Abd al-Rahman had achieved everything that power could achieve, through genuine ability, through ruthlessness, through 50 years of relentless work. And what he found at the end of it was that the earthly project, the cities, the armies, the titles, the palaces, did not add up to contentment in the way he had perhaps imagined it would. His final words were a warning. "O man, place not thy confidence in this present world." This is not a man who had failed. This is a man who had succeeded by every external measure the world could offer, and who used the clarity of his final years to say something true about what that success actually amounted to. All in all, Abd al-Rahman III stands as one of the great rulers of the medieval world. Full stop, not just of Islamic history. He was tolerant and brutal, visionary and calculating. He built something magnificent and sat at the end of his life wondering what it had cost him. He is, in other words, entirely human, and that is precisely what makes his story worth knowing. If this episode gave you something to think about, please subscribe to Muslim Biographies and turn on your notifications. Share this video with someone who you think would find it meaningful, and come back for the next story, because there are many more voices from Islamic history that deserve to be heard.